Everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Emily Spranger. I'm an academic trainer in the Center for Teaching and Learning. And I am very excited to have Dr. Linda Bloomberg come back for her second in a 4-part series for a qualitative research series. Thank you for joining us. If you missed the first session, you can feel free to go into our CTL webinars resource area and you can search for the first one there. I'll pop in some of that information in the chat as Dr. Bloomberg presents. So a couple of housekeeping items. Please, we do welcome questions in the chat. If you do want everyone to see what you are posting in the chat, make sure you do select the everyone option in the dropdown. Otherwise, sometimes it just comes to hosts and panelists. We welcome questions in the Q&A as always, and we will get to those as Dr. Bloomberg pauses or as time permits throughout this presentation. As always, we are recording our webinar and we will post it in the CTL webinars resource page for future reference. And last piece of information, if you would like to see the subtitles, feel free to hover over the bottom of your Zoom and hit the CC option and hit show subtitle if you would like to see that as the presentation continues. So without further announcements, I am going to pass this over to Dr. Bloomberg.
Thanks so much, Emily. Thanks to you and the CTL for hosting these webinars, this particular series called the Research Rigor Series for Qualitative Research. As Emily said, this is the second of 4, and all of them will be recorded and posted in the Commons for future reference. I'm very excited to be presenting this particular one because it's an area in qualitative research that impacts all of our research and is something that has to be addressed in every single research study. So it's a very important topic. And just judging by the amount of participants and the interest that's always shown in this topic, I'm really, really happy to go through this presentation and answer any questions and stop for discussion along the way. So I am going to stop for discussion and questions along the way, as I always do, and I'll let Emily know when I do so, and she can also then bring up some questions that have popped into the chat. So feel free to put your questions out there as we move forward, and when we do stop along the way, we'll look at those and also take questions live from the audience as well. At the end of the presentation, I will also stop for further questions and discussion, and we can revisit any areas of this presentation that people want to as necessary. So trustworthiness. This is a term that has been coined and applies specifically to qualitative research, because in quantitative research, there was actually no such terminology. The terminology that was always used in quantitative research was research rigor, and that includes validity, reliability, and generalizability, which, as you'll see as we move forward, are particularly quantitative terms and don't really apply to qualitative research. The idea of trustworthiness has taken the place of those terms. So I want to start out by just giving a very broad overview of what trustworthiness in qualitative research entails. The standards for evaluating a qualitative research study focus on how well the researcher has provided evidence that the findings and analysis of the findings authentically and accurately represent the participants' own experience. And we're going to get more to that idea in a moment. I just want to put that idea out there. So as the researcher, you will need to ensure that you're thinking very critically about the potential impact of all of the choices that you make regarding your study's design, including identification, justification, and limitations for all methodological choices, and what might be the underlying implicit and explicit biases and assumptions that you bring as a researcher to your research study. And I'm going to come back to this idea of biases in a moment. Transparency is key to ensuring trustworthiness. So transparency throughout the entire study, from the beginning to the end, is what is going to make your study a trustworthy study. And trustworthiness enables consumers of the research, in other words, the readers, the evaluators, to consider important details when assessing the worth, value, and utility of your study. And this applies very much to dissertation research in particular, because when it comes time for you to complete your study, write it up, and then present it at your dissertation defense, evaluators and your committee are going to be very interested in how you ensured trustworthiness and what you did to go about mitigating any threats to trustworthiness. And we're going to go through all of this in this presentation. But I just want to stop for a moment, and I know this is very early on, we're just on the first slide, but I'd just like to open this up for discussion, and Emily can let me know. Can you just put in the chat, if you choose to do so, it's not mandatory, what do you think is meant by implicit bias? What comes to mind when you think of that term, implicit bias? And Emily, if you could just read me the words as they come up.
Absolutely. Researcher bias. One's opinion. We need to see bias we may not have thought of initially. How we think of others. Unconscious bias. Transparency, bias without realizing it. Neutral opinion.
So yes, it's very much, it's a little different to explicit bias, because remember, explicit bias is something that you're aware of, that you can state, I'm biased in this way. It's a lot related to honesty and integrity. But implicit biases are sometimes those biases that we're not even aware we carry around with us. And we can be made aware of them in various ways, through journaling, through discussion with others, sometimes through experiences. We learn the hard way. Yes, I was biased in that respect. We may not have known it until a particular experience arises. So the implicit biases are these biases that are within us, and they're not necessarily bad or destructive, although they sometimes are, but they generally are characterized by being unknown or unconscious or not known until we're made aware of them. So that's what I mean by implicit biases. Thanks for those responses. I just want to discuss that right up front, because that's a really important concept to be aware of in doing qualitative research in particular. So what are the concerns regarding trustworthiness? Well, firstly, a major concern has to do with the confidence regarding the procedures and processes used in collecting data, analyzing data, and interpreting the findings, and how we go about writing up the findings and the conclusions of our studies. So establishing trustworthiness is therefore essential. It's critical. And trustworthiness is both a goal, it's something that we strive toward, and it's also a practice. We practice trustworthiness through different strategies, which we're going to get to in a moment. Now, what I also want to be very clear about, and I mentioned in the beginning, and I'm mentioning it again now, is that referring to quantitative standards of reliability, validity, and generalizability in qualitative research is incorrect. So as qualitative research as a field has evolved since the 60s and 70s, the idea of trustworthiness has come about to replace those terms that applied previously to quantitative research, being reliability, validity, and generalizability. And as you'll see in this presentation, there are specific terms that have replaced those terms. I just also want to go quickly over the learning objectives for today's session. I'd like all of us to become engaged in and address the 4 criteria of trustworthiness that constitute qualitative research, being credibility, confirmability, dependability, and transferability. I'd like for us to discuss the significance of each of these criteria and the strategies that you can use as a researcher for addressing and enhancing each of these criteria to ensure that your own study will be considered rigorous and therefore trustworthy. So again, the 4 standards of trustworthiness are credibility, dependability, confirmability, and transferability. And I'm going to go through each of these now on their own and discuss the criterion, and then after each one, discuss ways to enhance or address that criterion. So what we need to do in a study, what is necessary is that you plan all of this up front and that you work on addressing trustworthiness throughout your entire study, whether it's data collection, research design, selecting a research sample, analyzing your data, and then finally writing up your findings. So let's look at the first one, which is credibility. And credibility requires that your study is believable to readers and that it's also approved or verified by the research participants themselves. So this is quite a tall order. You have to satisfy the readers And you also should technically be satisfying those people or individuals who participated in your study. Because remember, we do need to credibly and authentically represent people who have willingly agreed to participate voluntarily in a research study. We want their experience to be authentic. We don't want to put our own spin on it based on our own experiences and biases. We want the study to speak for itself. We want our research participants' experience to be put out there and represented authentically. So how do we ensure that a study is credible? And there are several strategies, many in fact, which we can use to enhance the credibility of a study. Firstly, prolonged engagement. We do not just go in and conduct a study in a couple of hours and be done with it. A study requires an intensive amount of engagement with our research participants, spending time with them, interviewing them, getting to know their experiences, doing focus groups, observing them. And all of this takes time. So this is what I mean by prolonged engagement. Triangulation, we can triangulate our data from various perspectives. Firstly, we use method triangulation, which means that in qualitative research, we do not just use only one data collection method. We do need at least two. So for example, you would not just conduct interviews, but you'd augment your interviews with either a focus group or observation or a critical incident questionnaire. So that's what I mean by method triangulation. Data triangulation occurs through method triangulation because you're getting your data from all these different sources. And then sometimes we use what is called researcher triangulation, although this does not really occur in dissertation research. Researcher triangulation is where there is more than one researcher. And so there are different sets of eyes and ears on the research to make sure that it's credible. But in dissertation research, the research study is done just by you, the single researcher. Negative case analysis means that when it comes time to analyze your data, you don't just look at all the data that makes sense to you. Don't just look at all the data that fits nicely together like the pieces of a puzzle. You look also for those outliers, for those pieces of data that don't make sense or are surprising or unexpected. Because if you just throw those away and don't acknowledge them, you're undermining the credibility of the study. It means that you're throwing away pieces of data that need explanation, and negative cases need explanation too. You will need to make known to your readers why you think those particular pieces of information that don't seem to fit, why have they arisen? Where do they come from? What do they mean? Subjectivity checks means that you're constantly looking at your own subjectivity as a human researcher. Remember, in quantitative research, one of the goals is to be objective and to be neutral. Now, these two concepts of objectivity and neutrality do not apply to qualitative research at all. In fact, the qualitative researcher is not striving to be objective or neutral simply because we acknowledge that human beings cannot be objective or neutral. We all carry biases and assumptions because we're human. And so the goal is to declare these biases and assumptions, to be transparent about them rather than try and hide them or sweep them under the carpet. Peer debriefing means that we confer with our colleagues. The colleagues are our peers. So we would go to our colleagues and say, what do you make of this? What do you think of these findings? What is your take on it? What do you read into them? So that is what peer debriefing is. And then member checking means going back to the actual research participants themselves and giving them copies of the transcripts or even sections of your analysis and asking them for their opinion or their perspective on how much sense this makes to them. Remember, it's our participants' experiences that we're gathering and analyzing. And so to be true to them and to make sure that their experiences are represented authentically, we should be checking in with them to see what they make of our analysis and our perspective. So I'm going to stop there for a moment because we're going to move to the next criterion. But before we do, I just want to know if there are any questions about credibility and ways to ensure and address credibility.
Okay, let me see here a couple of things. How do we find someone to check in but not obligate someone?
We could never obligate someone. Well, is that regarding peer debriefing? I'm imagining. Or is it could also be member check-in. We always.
Yes, she said
okay.
yes.
Okay, so whether it's peer debriefing or member checking, we can never insist or mandate that a peer or a research participant will want to engage in this sort of activity. So we would just put it out as an invitation. I'd like to ask your opinion. I'd like for you to perhaps check on this transcript. There's no mandate to do it, but if you're willing to do it, I'd greatly appreciate it. And some people will want to, and some people would not want to engage in this, and we have to respect that.
Thank you for that, Dr. Bloomberg. I do have two other questions. Just as a follow-up question to that one, Dr. Bloomberg, how many should we get?
There's no hard and fast rule on that. You can put the invitation out to all of your research participants. You can do a sample of research participants. I would say sending it to all your research participants and letting whoever wants to respond. You may not get everybody, you may just get a small group, but at least you've given everybody in the study the opportunity to shed their light on what they believe your analysis looks like.
Thank you for that. And then someone had mentioned that they find peer debriefing is difficult since it's the one-to-one program. And I'd just like to add one little tiny piece, and then we'll see if Dr. Bloomberg has anything else. Don't forget to utilize the Commons, just being able to connect with people there as an option. Anything else, Dr. Bloomberg, that you...
Yeah, I just want to say that peer debriefing, I just want to be very clear that it doesn't mean that you send somebody a transcript that has anybody's name in it or any identifying information. If you are going to use peer debriefing and you're choosing a peer or a colleague to take a look at something, make sure that you de-identify it so that you're not sharing anything confidential and that you're maintaining the anonymity of your research participants that you've promised them in your consent letter to begin with. So use peer debriefing just as a general check. And same goes for member checking. You would only send back that particular person's transcript or if you've done an analysis, make sure that you're not including any identifiable information or anybody's name in that analysis.
Thank you so much. And then I did have, I'll pause here. Just if folks do have questions and you want to make sure I can get to it, if time permits, please pop it in the Q&A so I don't lose it in terms of how we're having conversation here. And then Dr. Bloomberg, I know that this has come up in our last webinar about quantitative research, and I know that's not something we're going to necessarily dive into, but someone was wondering if these concepts apply to quantitative research as well. And I just thought I would ask that.
Not necessarily. Quantitative research has very different protocols, and because you're only working with numbers and percentages, you're not going to be able to send anybody a transcript. And you do analysis in a very different way as well. It's all done through statistical analyses. So I don't believe the quantitative researchers use any of these strategies. These are particularly qualitative approaches.
All right, thank you for that. And we'll pause there. I know there's more to cover.
Okay. So I just want to say that for those people that are contemplating a quantitative study, please check in with your dissertation chair about ways to enhance rigor. And there are specific ways that you can address validity, reliability, and generalizability. And those are all very specific to quantitative research.
Okay, thank you so much. Oh, Dr. Bloomberg, just so we don't lose this in the context of things, I believe you mentioned negative case analysis. Did you discuss that? Could you explain what that?
The negative cases are the pieces that don't make sense, the pieces that are unexpected, the pieces that you may not have, you're quite surprised about. You can't just throw them away. You have to address them. Like, why did somebody say this, which is so different from what everybody else said? Those are important pieces of information to address and to analyze and to make sense of as well.
Okay, and then because we're talking about trustworthiness and credibility, and then I promise I'll stop.
No.
Will these strategies addressing trustworthiness be discussed by the researcher in the limitation subset section of Chapter 2, Chapter 3?
Okay, so that's a really good question, and I'd like to take that at the end because firstly, not all students at NCU are doing a 5-chapter dissertation. Some people are doing the ADE program, the Applied Dissertation Experience, which is a 3-section dissertation. So credibility and or the trustworthiness criteria fall into different chapters or sections depending on your program. And other schools may have other different templates. So just go according to the template that you've been given in your program, and you'll see where trustworthiness fits in. It's generally in the methodology section. And again, you have to discuss it in your findings and conclusions. You come back to it, like you circle back to it.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Bloomberg. We'll pause there.
And I just want to make one quick mention here, Emily, too, that negative case analysis is sometimes called discrepant analysis. There are different terms that are used. So it can be negative or discrepant. Something that doesn't fit. Basically, that's what it is. It doesn't fit with the rest of the pattern. It's like the puzzle piece that doesn't fit. So now we get to the second criterion, which is dependability. And dependability refers to the stability or consistency of the process, the research process that is used over time. And it means that the researcher has been very careful in conceptualizing the study. That means setting up the entire study, collecting the data, analyzing the data, interpreting it, and reporting your findings. So ways to address dependability means that you need to be very, very clear in the way that you present the entire methodology of your study. How did you gather a sample? What were your criteria for selecting that particular sample? Remember, in qualitative research, you're not using random sampling, you're using purposeful sampling, which means that you as the researcher are making specific decisions about who to include in your study and who to exclude. And that's a huge criticism of qualitative research, because it can be a limitation, but not if you do it systematically according to qualitative research principles. So you need to be just very clear and transparent about all the different ways that you created your sample, collected your data. Why did you choose particular methods of data collection over other methods? How did you analyze your data? What were all the different steps that you went through? And how did you present your data and represent your research participants' experiences? So the clarity of presentation, keeping field notes or a journal is an excellent way to make sure that you're following every step of the way regarding all the decisions that you make, so that you can go back and say, I made this decision because of this, and I made that decision based on this reasoning. And you may be asked some of these things in your defense. So it's really a good way to keep a check of all the different decisions that you made, so that if you do have to declare an audit trail, which is the third point, you've done this through your journal, your journaling, or your field notes. And an audit trail really is that. It's a step-by-step process where you have documented everything that you've done along the way of selecting the sample, collecting your data, analyzing the data, and then presenting the data. And I'm going to stop there now to talk about and address any questions regarding dependability.
Yes, I do believe it actually has something to do with the two ways you conduct your research. One was the interviews, and what was the other way that you mentioned? She stated two ways you can conduct research. One was interviews. And
well, there are a lot of different, if you're referring to, if the person is referring to data collection methods, there are interviews, there are focus groups, there are critical incident questionnaires, there's open-ended surveys, there's observation. All of these are ways of collecting data in qualitative research, whereas in quantitative, you're collecting data numerically through surveys mostly, and you're not focusing on people's words as much as on numbers and percentages.
All right, fantastic. And while we wait to see if there are any questions about dependability, I do want to get to Karina's question about it does have to go back to bias. So we're just going to address this and see if anyone has any dependability questions. Oh, pardon me. Sorry about that. Do you also do risk of bias calculation for quantitative studies?
I'm not sure about that for quantitative. Again, if somebody is considering quantitative, your dissertation chair would be the best person to ask.
Thank you.
There's no such thing as risk of bias. That term doesn't really apply to qualitative because we don't consider bias a negative, simply because we're not striving for objectivity and neutrality. We're more focused on being transparent about our biases. And I'm actually doing a webinar. The final one in the series is on the role and responsibilities of the qualitative researcher power and positionality. And that particular presentation is going to focus very heavily on researcher bias and researcher assumptions. So for anyone that wants to delve further into this whole idea of bias and transparency, that fourth webinar, which I believe is at the end of August, will be the one to attend. I think it's August 30, actually.
I can double check those dates and I will pop them in the chat.
And I've actually, the final slide of this presentation has all the dates of all four. So we'll be able to see it. Yeah. So
okay, great.
People can take a screenshot and then you've got it. You can put it on your calendar.
Absolutely. So in regards to dependability and journaling, when do you begin keeping a journal?
Right from the beginning. If you get into the habit of journaling, the journal can be something that you actually write in, or it can be something on your computer that you have as a Word document. But it's a really great way to keep a check of yourself throughout the research process, including what I love to do is, you know, when one starts a dissertation study, you've got, first you start with a broad topic and then you narrow it down to a specific research problem. And you've got all these ideas swirling around in your head about what could be great to study. And you've even got ideas about titles for the study. And I really recommend keeping a list of all those titles, because the title will change dramatically as you move forward. So I keep a list of all the titles in my journal, and then also a complete list of, or a description of everything that I do along the way for that study and what I feel about it. Journal your feelings, journal your, you know, your assumptions. And this will also bring out some of those implicit biases for you. As you start delving more into your own thought processes, you're going to become much more self-aware of what you're thinking and why. And the why is also really important. Like, why am I thinking this way? What's causing me to make this decision? Or what's causing me to be biased in this respect? Let me think a little bit more deeply about that. Where does this come from? What am I basing this idea on?
All right, wonderful. And I like that. I like that suggestion as you go along, and things may change, right? And then you can also probably do different types of research based off of some of the biases that maybe you uncover.
And it will change. Qualitative research, one of the key features is the flexibility. So you can be flexible from the very beginning. You can change things as long as you're explicit and transparent about it. I have students that change some of the research questions right up until the end of the proposal stage because something just wasn't right or something didn't fit properly. And then suddenly there's like this aha moment and, oh, I don't need that research question, or this research question can be changed slightly by wording it differently. Things like that are totally possible. Qualitative research is flexible, and that's what makes it very exciting.
Let me ask you this question with being flexible. I'm not quite sure how it would be transferable to methodology, but do we follow a prescribed methodology or do we customize it to the study?
You customize it to your study because every single study is different. So as the qualitative researcher, and this even applies to quantitative research, as the researcher, you set up and create a study that is unique. Even if you're using a recommendation for further research from another dissertation, you're going to do a study that's never been done before. You're going to have a research sample that no one's ever studied before. Those particular people in your study, that grouping of people will most likely never have been together before because you're creating it. You're selecting the people. You're selecting your methods. And so, yes, it's very unique, and it's very a creative process. But being creative, it's also, and I write about this in my book, you cannot think it's like writing a fictional story. There are processes and procedures and protocols to follow. So that qualitative research is not just like a free-for-all. There are specific, and this is what trustworthiness is all about. There are all these criteria that one has to adhere to, because you don't want to produce a study that's not believable, that's not dependable, or that's not trustworthy. So with all the flexibility, there are certain parameters as well.
All right, Dr. Bloomberg, thank you so much. And I think that's what we'll pause for right now.
Good, thanks, Emily. Okay, so the third criterion is called confirmability. And this refers to the quality of your study's findings. Remember, the goal is not to produce objective or neutral findings, but rather findings that illustrate your reflexivity, your ability to check in with yourself, to address any biases, assumptions, preconceived ideas, and your subjectivity, because we do carry subjectivity. We're humans. We're not objective. We cannot put aside our biases and our assumptions. This is what makes us human. So declaring these and being transparent and upfront about these is really, really necessary. And what I did in my own dissertation, and I've seen it done with many other dissertations, is that you do declare your biases and assumptions up front, sometimes in the first chapter or the third chapter. I'm not sure what it is, depending on your template. But then at the end of your study, at the end of a qualitative study, I often ask my students, and I did this myself in my dissertation, to reflect, to do or to write up a final reflection where you reflect back on your initial assumptions and biases and see where you stand now. And it's really going back. You can look in your journal, you can look back to where you first wrote about your biases, and reflect on it. Like, do I still hold those biases? And if so, why? And if not, why? So reflexivity, which is a qualitative term, encourages critical thinking and reflection. And this is really central to qualitative research, because all of trustworthiness needs to be thought about. Sorry, I just need to put my dog down. All of trustworthiness needs to be thought about very carefully and critically and laid out transparently. So how do we then address confirmability? And I've kind of given away some of this already in that slide, is reference to the literature. In other words, we want to always tie our studies findings back to the literature to make it research based. And we also want to maintain that audit trail through journaling, so that we've got documentation of every decision made along the way, and that will feed into the confirmability of your study. So I'm going to stop there again for questions. And I just want to bring this idea up. As I'm talking about these trustworthiness criteria, you may be in your mind thinking, well, that sounds a little like validity, or that sounds a little like reliability, and it does. But remember, we don't refer to reliability and validity in the qualitative world. We refer to these other terms. But there is a linkage. And so what are your ideas about confirmability? Does it sound like reliability? Does it sound like validity? Does it sound like generalizability? What does it sound like to you?
I'm going to wait until a few moments just so people can process that.
Sure.
And someone mentions validity.
Remember, there's not a direct link, but there is a little bit of overlap in the idea that it brings. So confirmability, if we go back a moment to, it refers to the quality of the study's findings. That really is kind of like reliability. Are these findings reliable? Whereas the first one, dependability, is consistency, and that sounds a little bit like validity. Are the findings valid? Are they stable and consistent?
Some other folks have chimed in and had mentioned reliability right before you mentioned reliability, and then someone also mentioned validity uses numbers.
It can, but that's in quantitative research. And that's why we don't use it for qualitative research, because we're not trying to establish valid findings. We're trying to establish credible, dependable, and confirmable findings.
Okay. And then folks, any questions on the confirmability?
Confirmability, yeah, sorry. Scrolling around here.
No worries, that's okay. Going for a ride here on the PowerPoint. But any questions on the confirmability at this point?
Confirmability is pretty straightforward. The big one was credibility, which is believability, because you want both the readers and your research participants to believe that what you've found is credible and believable. And the one that we're going to move to now, which is transferability, is often a sticking point, and I'm going to spend a bit more time on it.
Someone had just mentioned it's a little hard because there's a fine line between the differences.
Well, the fine line is this: the actual criteria are pretty different from each other, but where there's overlap is in the ways that you address them. So here, an audit trail addresses confirmability, but if we go back, you'll see that an audit trail also addresses dependability. So some of these strategies, you're killing two birds with one stone. By maintaining your journal, you're addressing credibility, because you're making sure that your findings are believable and you're speaking about your biases. you're addressing dependability, and you're also addressing confirmability. So there is overlap in that respect, in the way that we strategize to mitigate threats to trustworthiness. And that's a term that comes up a lot. We mitigate the threats. The threats to trustworthiness means that trustworthiness is weak. So we want to mitigate that. We want to make sure that doesn't happen. And that's why we take all these different steps.
Thank you, Dr. Bloomberg. Nothing at this time.
Perfect. So we're going to move now to transferability. And I just want to read a particular quote. It's just easier to put the entire quote out here verbatim than try and summarize it. And this is from my book. Because findings of qualitative research studies are unique to a small number of particular environments and individuals, it is impossible to demonstrate that the findings and conclusions will always apply or be transferable to other situations and populations. I just want people to take a moment to think about that. So the impossibility is that what we find is always going to apply out there in the world, which is equivalent to the idea of generalizability, which is a huge goal of quantitative research. So transferability is kind of equivalent, but not the same as generalizability. And I'm going to explain this now, and we're going to talk more about it because it's sometimes a little bit of a difficult concept to wrap one's head around. Transferability refers to the potential applicability of findings to other similar contexts or settings. A study's findings might apply to other similar experiences, contexts, or situations, but you cannot claim that your findings are generalizable. You should, sorry, I'll change that afterwards. There was just a bit of a typo over here. So you cannot claim that your findings are going to be generalizable to other contexts or experiences as one would do in quantitative research. That's a goal of quantitative research. My findings are generalizable because they're representative of a large number of individuals. And this is possible because you're using such large samples in quantitative research. Whereas in qualitative research, you're using much smaller purposeful samples, non-random samples. And so we're not aiming for generalizability. What we're aiming for is for readers to determine whether or not your findings make sense in their own particular context or setting. So this is a really big part of transferability, that it is not the researcher that determines if a study is transferable. It's the reader of the research that makes that determination, that decision. So many students also incorrectly assume that lack of generalizability is a limitation of their study. But in qualitative research, this is not a limitation, simply because qualitative researchers do not seek to generalize their findings. So as I said in the previous slide, it's the readers, not the researcher, that makes the decision of whether and to what extent the study could apply to other similar settings or contexts. As the researcher, you must provide very clear description of your context and your findings, which is referred to by Guber as thick description. And then your readers will hopefully be able to make the decision as to whether or not your study's findings could apply to their own particular context. And that is all you can hope for as a qualitative reader in terms of transferability. We're not trying to guarantee generalizability. And so we cannot ever claim that lack of generalizability is a weakness or a limitation of a qualitative study. And I've put that here as a big caveat, that limitations of a qualitative research study are not related to issues of generalizability. So if you were ever thinking of putting that in your limitations, I suggest you eliminate it, because that is not it's not a limitation if you're conducting qualitative research. And I'm going to stop there for a few questions, but I just want to make clear that the only way we can try to ensure, not guarantee, but ensure transferability, because we do want our readers to think, wow, that could apply to my context. I see some value here. We do want our readers to walk away with that feeling. We do it through thick description, which means very detailed description, but we leave it up to the reader to make that decision. And I'm going to stop there for a moment, because transferability is something that sometimes is difficult to conceptualize because it's different to generalizability. and it has its own set of requirements.
And so I know there will be some questions about transferability, but I do want to come back to the confirmability piece,
Okay,
because
go back.
while folks are kind of letting that transferability sink in, would confirmability be covered in the literature review, or is that something that's throughout, or is there a specific place where that should be covered?
Because I said that we tie it back to the literature. No, in your implications part of your findings chapter or your findings section, you would then tie the literature back into your findings and try and make connections. You don't actually discuss it in the literature review. It's more about in the findings section of the dissertation.
Okay, thank you so much. And if it's all right, if we can go back to the transfer.
And I just want to say, it's because we want research to be grounded in the literature. That's what makes a strong study. And so once you've done your research, you're then going to go back to previous studies and other literature and say, well, my findings fit with this, or my findings negate this. Remember, you don't have to be the same as other studies. You don't have to make sure that your study follows a pattern. If your study finds something completely different, that's absolutely fine. But when you refer it back to the literature, you would say there's a gap because the literature said this and my study found this. So this is what I make of this finding. And then your interpretation comes in, like, why did my study find something different? Or why have I come up with some different findings than what other studies found? That's what makes the richness of a research study. It's not all about like a cookie cutter recipe for success. It's more about how you as the researcher go about setting up the study and then addressing your findings in an authentic manner by making sure that trustworthiness is in the forefront of your mind.
Thank you, Dr. Bloomberg. I know some questions about transferability may bubble up here, but I do want to take the time to ask this question just because we did touch on journaling. So this person mentions this may be a question for another webinar, but how do you suggest a journal be organized? For example, should I have a section just on biases, or should it be more of a chronological diary?
Either way is fine. Remember, the journal is your own document that you don't have to disclose to anybody else. So whatever way you want to set it up, you can set it up as a diary, like day by day. You could set it up by themes. You could set it up by the way that you just described, different ways of like slicing and dicing it. Mm-hmm. It's just a document that is something that's special to you, that's meaningful to you, and that you've created. You'd never have to show this journal to anybody.
Okay, thank you so much for asking.
And that's why being really honest and upfront with yourself and journaling your feelings and your perspectives is just valuable to you. It's not for anyone else to make a judgment on.
All right, thank you so much. And Tiffany, I see your post. Just want to clarify, this is the audit trail, correct?
The audit trail is the documentation. But remember, again, you don't ever have to show it. You just have to draw from it when you need to write up certain chapters. You could go back to your journal and say, well, at the very beginning, I thought of creating a sample on this basis, and then I decided to do it that way. Or I first started out thinking this was a case study, and then I decided it was more of a phenomenology. So all these little things you could use to try and make your case as to why you made certain decisions, but you don't have to show anybody your journal or your documents or your inner thoughts. And that's more for the way that it's more useful just for your own personal and professional growth, and for making sure that you document the process in your chapter as needed.
And I think to Dr. Bloomberg's point, it's that since it's just for you, the student, it's a discovery process, right? So as you're moving through the journey, as she mentioned, with qualitative research being flexible, things may move. And so then maybe you need to look back at something else that's not necessarily in your literature review, but it helps spark an idea for something else.
It's wonderful for sparking ideas, for thinking more critically and deeply, for examining certain decisions that you made, and also for keeping that chronological documentation of how you move through your entire study from the very beginning right up to the end.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Bloomberg. I do have a question about transferability. Can the researcher use the gaps in other studies to support transferability?
I'm not really sure that I understand that question.
Okay.
If the person wants to explain what they mean, like just with an example, it would help.
Okay.
If they could provide an example of that, then I'm happy to try and answer it, but I'm not really sure what it means about the gaps to support transferability.
Okay, and we'll wait to see if that can be expanded on a little bit. And the next question is, does bracketing fit in here?
Yeah, bracketing is a particular term that applies to phenomenology, and it very much means bracketing your own assumptions, which you have to be aware of your own assumptions and biases, and you kind of put a bracket around them so that you have them in your view. So bracketing is definitely a technique that is specific to phenomenology, but of course it can apply to any qualitative research. And if anyone's interested in that, then it's a great topic to read up further on. I know some universities use what is called a bracketing interview. So before a student starts their research study, they are required to have an interview with their dissertation committee. And it's called a bracketing interview because it's a kind of disclosure or an examination of some biases at the beginning to make sure that they're in clear focus and that one is aware of what one's thinking as one goes into a study, which could be potentially, well, it's beneficial to your study because it makes you much more transparent, but it also makes sure that you don't let any of your biases creep in and affect some of the decisions that you make regarding selection of samples or collecting findings or analyzing and interpreting your findings. So I really love that idea of a bracketing interview. We don't do it here at NCU, but of course you're welcome to do it if it's something you want. You could ask your chair to help you set that up.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bloomberg. Several people have said thank you so much for the presentation. They've learned so much. Somebody did ask if they could watch it over and over again. And I totally understand that, just getting all of the information. So I know Dr. Bloomberg will share at the end the dates that we of this 4-part series. And of course, you can check that out in our resource
and
center.
You'll have a recording put up in the comments. So anyone who has the recording, which is easily accessible,
yes,
CTL, can watch this again at your leisure and go through some of these points again.
Yes, absolutely. But before we do wrap up, is there anything else that you would like to address?
Well, I just want to see how much time we have, like 12 more minutes.
12 minutes.
I was just going to say that all the information has come out of my book, and the book is actually coming out in a 5th edition shortly. So this is sort of my reference list for the information that I've shared here with you. And then also I wanted to see if there were any questions and discussion points here right at the end. And then here is what you can just screenshot for yourselves. The next two are August 1st and August 30th. The August 1st is everyday ethics in qualitative research. And because of since the pandemic, a lot of new ethical considerations have risen to the forefront. And I'm going to be dealing a lot with some of these, which are really important for researchers going forward. And then the final one on August 30th is reviewing the qualitative researcher's role, power, and positionality, where I'm going to be looking a lot more at biases and assumptions and the researcher's role in terms of declaring positionality by using a positionality statement, which has again become a very important part of the qualitative research process.
All right, wonderful.
Let's I'm going to stop here for the questions. If there are any, I'm happy to take any questions. We have like about 10 minutes left.
We do have a few questions that have just popped up. So yeah, if there is anything else that you'd like to ask, we do have about 10 minutes left. And if we end early, we end a little early. That's okay too.
Yeah.
Can this webinar be cited?
I think there is a way to cite webinars, and I've seen people cite them in dissertations. If you look at the APA manual, there is a way to cite a webinar or to cite a presentation. There definitely is, and the CTL will have this recorded with a specific date on it.
Yes.
The date is on the cover page, so I believe you can cite a webinar. The same as you can cite conversations or even letters and communication, email communication.
And I have had a couple of questions about the this webinar and the previous webinar, I am happy to email all of our attendees a copy of this recorded email or this recorded webinar and the previous one as well too, with direct links, just to make it easy for you
wonderful
to find. Question here. In my literature review, some studies are not able to answer the research questions. Can I transfer my findings to answer the gaps in a study that may have been left unanswered?
You can address the study and say how your research findings compare or contrast with that other particular study. So it's not really, it is kind of transferability in a way, because you're taking another study and putting it up against your study and looking at how your study compares. So that is a form of transferability. But transferability really means looking at a study and saying whether the findings would apply to your professional topic or your topic. So yes, there is kind of a fine line there, but I guess that is one way of, it's a unique way of thinking about transferability.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Bloomberg. Well, if you don't mind, can you hop back to slide 17?
What can you just tell me? I don't, oh, there.
Oh gosh.
Okay, here we go. I see.
Oh,
Yeah.
there we are. Oh, it's right there on the bottom. Okay, I was like, I'm not sure. Oh yes, they want to take a look at the book. No problem there.
So this is this one over here, and the 4th edition is currently in the NCU library. The 5th edition is actually in press at the moment, so it's being published. It will be out this year. It will have a 2023 date on it. This 4th edition is 2019. And I'm in no way pushing the sale of this book, but Sage do offer 30% off with this code. And I organize that with them for all of the presentations that I do that pertain to this book.
Thank you, Dr. Bloomberg. And Alan Haynes just popped in the chat. APA 7th edition, pages 341 and 344 for webinars.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Thanks so much. That's wonderful. Thanks for doing that.
Let me see a couple of other questions here. I believe phenomenological reduction is a part of trustworthiness. Is that correct?
Phenomenological reduction has to do with analysis.
Okay.
Reduction in analysis. All of analysis pertains to trustworthiness because your analysis has to be trustworthy. So yes, it would relate to trustworthiness in terms of how well and thoroughly you conducted that analysis and how you describe it.
Are you able to spend any time explaining ethnomorphism?
Not really in this session.
Okay.
But I would really encourage you to read up more on it and see how trustworthiness applies.
Okay, fantastic. And so many folks have mentioned just that they have learned so much from this webinar and they're super grateful for your time.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Oh, and some people had mentioned they had been stressing about how to document trustworthiness, and they have found this very informative and helpful. So thank you.
Great, I hope so, because it's not that difficult. If you have a clear idea, as I've explained it here, about what to do to address trustworthiness and to mitigate the threats to trustworthiness, then just being very clear about that in your dissertation and describing what you did, how you took care of things, is all you need to do. And then you have done what you need to do as a qualitative researcher.
All right, well, Dr. Bloomberg, I don't see any other questions coming up in the chat. So everyone is aware that they will be emailed this resource here. And I would just like to thank you, as always, Dr. Bloomberg, for coming and presenting and being just a well of knowledge in this area. And we're so grateful for it. I know our students are.
Oh, well, it's really my pleasure. I love talking about qualitative research, and I'm only too happy to help students get their studies, the qualitative research studies, in good order. And thanks so much to you, Emily, and to the CTL for always hosting these webinars to help our students and our faculty. I know faculty attend these too at times, yes, and not just for students. So thanks very much, as always.
Oh my goodness. And until we all see you the next time, join us in August for Dr. Bloomberg's next webinar. Thank you all and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Emily. Take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye.